Yeah, I feel like this review is pretty long overdue. Iron Man. Now, Iron Man came out in 2008, was directed by Jon Favreau, and is the first film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that has just taken over Hollywood now. And this all started with Iron Man, and this was a movie that really not a lot of people had faith in. And this was a pretty big risk for 2008. Sure, Iron Man had proved to be a popular superhero back in the 70s and even in some of the 80s with the comics, but at the time the movie was going into production, people didn't really care that much about Iron Man in the popular consciousness. He wasn't one of the A-tier Marvel characters. That would have to go to Spider-Man and the X-Men. And even Blade had proven to be a pretty significant box office draw. So Iron Man was kind of a risk, and his legacy as this philanderer, this womanizer, this arms dealer, he's not a great guy. He's got a lot of moral flaws and hang-ups. So would this really translate well to the superhero genre that was kind of just in its infancy? But I'm happy to say that this movie does work to a surprising degree, and I don't think anybody expected it to work this well, and a big part of that has to go to the casting of Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, as Tony Stark, because Robert Downey Jr. was the perfect person to cast in this role. His career was kind of in the dumps at this point. He had a lot of issues in his past with substance abuse, so his story actually kind of mirrors Iron Man's story in this movie. And while this movie does focus around the redemption of Tony Stark, him coming to grips with his life and finding purpose, you could say the same thing is true about the redemption of Robert Downey Jr. After this movie came out, he was a big star again. It really rejuvenated his career. It gave him a lot more purpose. It gave him something to hang his hat on. And that's just a beautiful thing. When an actor and character work so well and seems so seamless, just born to play this character. And this movie just benefits from all of that because you buy Tony Stark as a character first and foremost. Because you see him at the beginning of this movie and he's this narcissistic, selfish, playboy, womanizer, arms dealer. He doesn't give a care for any of the damage that his weapons are causing. It's just a business to him. And it's not even his business that he started from the ground up. It's a business that he inherited from his father. So while there is some pressure to live up to the legacy of Howard Stark, he's really more concerned about doing his own thing, being his own person. And this kind of characterization could have made the character of Tony Stark to be this unlikable jerk that you just hate watching, just want to turn it off because he's just such a terrible person. But the way Robert Downey Jr. delivers some of these really callous lines, it does make you lean in a little bit. You want to know more about this guy. Why is he the way he is? Because he's actually really entertaining to watch. He's got such a charm about him that while you're kind of repulsed by some of the things he's saying, he just says them in such a carefree and charismatic way that you just can't help to be hooked in by this character. But all this takes a turn when he's overseas, somewhere in the Middle East. I can't remember specifically where, but his convoy gets bombed and he gets taken prisoner by these terrorists. The Ten Rings is what they call themselves, which, okay, that's a nice little homage to the Mandarin. I hope they really explore that in future movies and don't just take a steaming dump on the concept like they did in Iron Man 3. But here they're this terrorist cell. They want Tony Stark to make them a bomb, so he reluctantly agrees, even though he's not really making a bomb. He's making an arc reactor, which is the thing in his heart that's keeping him alive, because when his convoy got bombed, he got some shrapnel in the chest, and it's just creeping to his heart. So he needs this little reactor, this little device that goes in his chest that's straight out of the comics that keeps the shrapnel at bay, keeps him alive. And that's just classic Iron Man. I love how in this movie they use comic book concepts that seem a little far-fetched, a little outdated, and just make it work with the movie, with the world that they're building. They kind of bring it down to earth and make it plausible for the world we're living in, but still giving it that little bit of comic book iconography, comic book flair. They don't shun away from any of the classic Iron Man visuals. When you see Iron Man in the cave on the security camera and he's just got this glowing arc reactor, that is a classic comic book image right there. And then while he's making this bomb, he's actually building an Iron Man suit, his Mark I prototype Iron Man suit. And they could have made this look like whatever. But they chose to make it look like his first appearance Iron Man suit from the comic. And I respect them for that, because the early 2000s was not an era where there was a lot of weight put on comic book accuracy or really respecting the source material. Sure, you had stuff like Spider-Man that isn't as afraid to go into that kind of cheesy comic book imagery. But what was more common is you had stuff like X-Men that would never put on the yellow spandex. They had to get everybody in black leather, make it tactical. But here with Iron Man and what we'll see going forward with the MCU, they do a great job at still making things practical and plausible for the real world, but not compromising on comic book imagery, comic book accuracy, if you want to use that word. There's still a lot of influence from the comics in this movie. I think that speaks to a greater guiding principle that Kevin Feige, the producer of all these movies, had, and I don't really know where it went, but at one time he believed in taking these characters back to basics. Look back at the source material, look at what made those characters work on the page, and just translate that to film. That was his purpose. That's what all of the Phase 1 movies did, is what most of the Phase 2 movies did. Really up until, I don't know, maybe Civil War, is what guided the cinematic universe into being as popular as it was. Because all these characters felt like they were ripped straight out of the page and put on the big screen. And sure, things are going to change, things are going to tweak when you change mediums, but the core of who Iron Man is, who Tony Stark is, and as represented by Robert Downey Jr., is such a great example of that translation working incredibly well. But in the movie, when Iron Man breaks out and he's in his Mark 1 and he's just lighting dudes up with flamethrowers and guns and all this chaos is happening, it is absurdly entertaining. And this movie really does succeed, not just in the character building of Tony Stark and the redemption of Tony Stark, but also just in fun, entertaining action, because whenever Iron Man suits up, it is the coolest thing you've ever seen in a movie up until that point. The way the suit just comes together in bits and pieces and just builds to this iconic Iron Man costume. And I'm also really glad that we see multiple iterations of the Iron Man costume. He doesn't just come out of the gate with the fully formed red and yellow Iron Man suit. We see the Mark 1, which is the bulkier, less practical version. Then we see the silver one, the slicked down Mark 2, that will end up becoming the War Machine armor later on, and I love that little Easter egg in this movie for that. But it's not until the Mark 3 when we finally get that classic Iron Man costume, and he does all the poses, and he does all the different gimmicks, the repulsor blast, the unibeam blast, all the great Iron Man fan service that us nerds back in 2008 just couldn't get enough of. That's all in here, and it's all done in the service of a story worthy of Iron Man. It's about Tony Stark, this very flawed individual, coming to grips with his own mortality, emerging from the cave with a renewed sense of purpose that he's going to serve mankind and not destroy it with his weapons. He shuts down his weapon manufacturing. He becomes this superhero, this avenging force that will right the wrongs that his weapons have caused, because he realized his weapons were going into the wrong hands for years, and he was supplying both sides of the war, so he's going to rectify that. He's going to fix that problem, which of course doesn't make him a lot of friends, because you have his business partner Obadiah Stane, played by Jeff Bridges, who really embodies this Obadiah Stane character. I'm not the biggest Jeff Bridges fan, but the way he shaved his head and grew out that beard, he looks like comic book Obadiah Stane, and that's really impressive. Now, the writing for him, once he kind of flips on Iron Man and he turns evil, does leave some to be desired. I do feel like the villain in this movie, which you could argue is either Obadiah Stane or the Ten Rings, there's really a couple different villains, but they're in cahoots with each other. I feel like just giving Obadiah his own Iron Man suit, while it is more or less comic book accurate, it just doesn't leave that much of an impression. Whereas if they had someone like the Mandarin, or someone right out of left field like Whiplash, who they did bring in Iron Man 2, would have just left a lot more of an impression, where it's not just big mech suit versus big mech suit. But even so, this movie is still incredibly entertaining. When the action goes down, it goes down. When the character moments need to hit, they hit surprisingly hard. And something that I haven't really talked about yet is the character of Pepper Potts, played by Gwyneth Paltrow. She's likable enough. She works for Tony Stark. She's kind of his personal assistant or maid, or really whatever Tony needs her to be, but she definitely has this kind of infatuation with Tony Stark, and he definitely has some interest in her, and you see the relationship develop now that he's been humbled and is starting to change his ways. He confides in her, and this romantic relationship does blossom in this movie in a very organic and mature way. It doesn't feel forced in the slightest. They clearly have a long history with each other. It's not like they just met that day or the first time we see them in the movie. They have history, so they can build on that. But even more than that, it works because she notices a change in Tony Stark's character, that he's wanting to be better. He's wanting to do more. He's wanting to serve instead of be served. And the arc wouldn't really come across as strongly if you didn't have a character like Pepper Potts to confide that in. And I guess the last thing I'll talk about with this movie is the visual effects and sound design, because this is really the part of the movie that just took my breath away back in 2008, and it still surprisingly takes my breath away today, because the Iron Man suit uses a couple different techniques to come to life. There's sometimes when it's an actual practical suit, and then there's other times when it's just completely CGI. And I don't know if this is just because they flip-flop between both so often that your eyes can't really pick out which one's the CGI one and which one's the practical one. Although now, more than 10 years down the line, you still can start to see the cracks where, yeah, maybe that one was more CGI and that one is more practical. You can kind of start to tell now, but it's still very impressive CGI. It looks real, and what really sells it, and I think is what makes it not necessarily sell as much in the newer Marvel movies, is the sound design on the suit. Because here, when you see the suit moving and manipulating and charging up, there are all these very specific sounds that give it a much more tactile feel than we get with like the nano suit. That one doesn't have the same kind of click-clack practical sound that this one does, and I love this suit for that, because every little thing that moves, every little locking mechanism that comes into place has a sound, and I really wish they kept those suits and that sound design going for longer than they did. Those are all my thoughts on the first Iron Man. Again, this one kicked off the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This was the big hit Marvel needed to start their Avengers initiative, their Avengers plans, and the little Easter egg at the end of this movie really set that up. Although, again, 2008, people didn't really know to stay till the end of credits, so I'm pretty sure a lot of people missed that little Nick Fury teaser at the end, but those that did stay, well, they were treated for a nice surprise. And about 10 plus years later, we have this empire that is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it all started with this incredibly small budget, risky film from an independent studio that still needed Paramount to distribute it. They didn't even have the Disney money yet. This was all boots on the ground. Let's make a good comic book movie with the character of Iron Man. Let's make it relatable. Let's make it funny. Let's make it entertaining. And let's do the character justice from what was on the page. And this movie succeeds in all of that. Can't praise this movie enough. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about the first Iron Man? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.